Patricia Cosgrove.
Sorry, no, just trying to turn off my phone, turn on the microphone. Hi, thanks very much for coming in. And I suppose I was just listening there about, like, I think last week was really important that Crava were in, and that they outlined, I suppose, that it's not, if we're looking at special emergency care or we're looking at aftercare, that it's not about money, that it's the provision of a service rather than about money. And I'm just wondering, when like, I know that like Kate, that you said there, that there was young people that were moved from a voluntary community setting into special emergency care. And, like, I suppose for that to happen, I would imagine that things must have been, very difficult. And maybe that there was that there was, maybe the ratio of staff, I don't know. But would you imagine, like, and in fairness to Crava last week, that they very much said that TUSLA are very supportive, but they are running on a very tight budget. Like, money is always, I suppose, is limiting them around, developing their own capacity about buildings and about, and would you say that when you're looking at, when your people are in care, if you're looking at arrangements, would the voluntary community sector always come ahead, or our TUSLA itself always come ahead of the private sector?
So I think like I said, Deputy, we were absolutely committed to wanting to expand TUSLA, our community and voluntary sector, over private sector. That's our commitment as a public service. I think it's very important, and we say this, we pay the community and voluntary sector a grant, irrespective of the number of young people that are on placement. And that is something we don't do in the private sector. And also, I mean, the costs that we give the community and voluntary sector is actually more than we give the private sector, not just in terms of bed occupancy levels, but we pay, it works out, and Pat can give the detail if you wanted. The cost of a private placement is actually just slightly lower than the cost of a TUSLA or a community and voluntary. And we also have a scheme in place with the community and voluntary sector if there's particular damage done to a property or, incident of concern, that they can apply for funding under that. But I do want to say I absolutely recognise the challenge that the community and voluntary sector have. We absolutely value the relationship with them. We want to support them to scale. But they are struggling, I think, to get the staffing. But more importantly, I think the biggest challenge for the community and voluntary sector is not having the ability to fund capital investment in terms of building residential
homes. And whose
homes.
responsibility is that, Kate, though? Surely it's not them themselves. If they get a certain amount of money, is it from TUSLA to be looking at the department to say they have to provide more money? Or, like, we say, if you're measuring key performance indicators or you're looking at outcomes, is it just based on cost, if you're, or is it based on social outcomes as well?
Yeah, no, it would never be decisions just around cost, ever. It's obviously, we're saying the principle that we have is that as a public sector, we want further investment. We want to rebalance the provision of care into TUSLA statutory centres and C&V centres. But it does just become, they are separate entities, they're separate governance structures, separate boards. And so in terms of, it's a wider discussion around, is the state going to invest capital investment into, separate entities? And I think that's a wider discussion in terms of the state's decision around capital investment in the C&V sector.
And would there be an option maybe that we say charitable organisations might be able, like the building, if there's buildings available, but even religious organisations really, but they have an availability that they might be able to put those, work with the voluntary community sector to be able to increase their capacity. But I'm just wondering, who is the one? Is it yourselves is it TUSLA that are looking to increase that capacity within? Like, I think the last thing we want to do is go down the private sector for the vision of most vulnerable children we have in our state, and so, like, I would think that of all costs, you should avoid doing that, giving that over to private companies, I suppose, because their ultimate game is that they're going to make money. Yeah. That's what a private company does.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, is there ways to work around?
Yeah.
Work, with other departments, maybe that capacity can be increased within the voluntary community sector, around, around buildings, I think.
Yeah. I suppose within our control, I mean, we worked, a lot with the voluntary sector back in 23 and 2024 in terms of the cost of living increase, the inflationary measures, and we did secure an extra 5.2 million for them in terms of just the providers that we work with to support them with some of that funding gap. And obviously then within the WRC agreement, additional funding has been given in terms of the staffing levels. But in terms of capital infrastructure that we get at the moment, we are only starting. I mean, really from 2018 to 2023, TUSLA didn't have the full capital investment that it needed in order to open additional residential units. It is costly to open them, and so we have invested and opened our own statutory residential units over that period, which has been great. A decision will have to come wider than TUSLA around the state's position around capital investment in the CMV sector, and we'll obviously work with that. We advocate and represent on behalf of the community and voluntary sector all of the time. And what we have done where possible is, particularly in our separated children's service, we have a hybrid model in place where it's a TUSLA-owned building, but one of the community and voluntary providers are staffing and running it for us. So we're looking at any opportunity to be able to do that. But I think, CRAVA themselves or any of the community voluntary sectors would recognise the capital investment as the most significant, perhaps barrier to be able to scale their capacity.
Yeah. So I suppose as us as a committee, should we be looking at the department to say, why aren't you funding these capital expenditures so that, I suppose, ultimately, you don't want the care of children to be given over to private providers, and I suppose that's the kind of question that we'd have to raise as a committee. Do we, as a state, have a long-term plan about children and care?
Well, I mean, the first thing to say in terms of the long-term plan, the Department of Children are finalising the whole of government alternative care policy, which we certainly have contributed to. I know CRAVA, I know, wider stakeholders that have all contributed to that, and we're really looking forward to seeing that policy and seeing that whole of government commitment in terms of the provision of alternative care, so the provision of care to children across the state. And within that, what we would hope to see is that across government departments, there's prioritisation given to children care, whether that's access to housing, access to health services, maybe decisions around capital investment, but certainly it's around the fact that the that the community and voluntary sector is a small sector in terms of the provision of residential, and it's just looking to see what is their capacity. And certainly they have, I think, additional capacity within the aftercare space. We work with a huge number, over almost 500 community and voluntary services in terms of the provision of community services. So, a huge partnership for us. I think it's more of a specific matter for residential, because the cost of opening a children's residential home that is compliant with the standards expected through HICWA and through the regulations, is a significant investment.